The crystal chandelier in my dining room caught the afternoon light just the way it had for the past 35 years, casting tiny rainbows across the mahogany table where I'd served countless family dinners. But as I sat there that Tuesday in October, staring at the legal documents spread before me, I knew this would be the last time I'd look at that chandelier the same way. My hands, weathered from decades of gardening and cooking for the people I loved, trembled slightly as I reached for my reading glasses. At 73 years old, I thought I'd heard every cruel thing a person could say. I was wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Chen, though everyone has always called me Dotty. I never minded the nickname. It suited my personality, or at least the personality I'd cultivated over 7 decades of putting everyone else's needs before my own. I'm what you might call a classic grandmother figure, the kind who keeps homemade cookies in the freezer and remembers every birthday, anniversary, and graduation date of her extended family. My late husband Richard and I built our life in the suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, where the desert heat never bothered me much and the sunsets reminded me daily that beauty could emerge from the harshest conditions. Richard passed away 4 years ago, leaving me alone in our sprawling ranch house with its 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and enough space to host every holiday gathering our family could imagine. We'd bought this house in 1987 when our son Daniel was just 12 years old, scraping together every penny we had for the down payment because we wanted him to have the kind of childhood memories that only come from a real family home. Richard worked double shifts at the electronics plant while I taught elementary school, and together we turned this house into something special. Every room told a story of family dinners, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and quiet evenings when love felt as natural as breathing. Daniel grew up to be everything we'd hoped for: kind, intelligent, hardworking, and successful. He graduated from Arizona State University with a degree in finance, landed a good job at an investment firm in Scottsdale, and by 34, had built the kind of career that made Richard and me beam with pride at neighborhood barbecues. He was our only child, the center of our universe, the reason we'd sacrificed vacations and new cars and restaurant dinners for 20 years. Every choice we made was about giving Daniel the best possible foundation for his future. When Richard died, Daniel stepped up in ways that reminded me why I'd always been so proud of him. He handled the funeral arrangements, helped me navigate the insurance paperwork, and made sure I knew I wasn't alone in the world. For 3 years after his father's death, Daniel called me every Tuesday evening without fail, visited every other weekend, and included me in his social life in ways that made me feel valued rather than pitied. He understood that grief isn't something you get over. It's something you learn to carry, and having family support makes the burden lighter. Everything changed 6 months ago when Daniel started dating Cassandra Williams. Cassandra is 28 years old, blonde, and beautiful in the way that makes restaurant servers assume she's somebody important. She works in marketing for a high-end real estate company, drives a white BMW that she calls her baby, and has the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told she's not the center of attention. From the moment Daniel brought her to Sunday dinner at my house, I could see she was different from the other women he'd dated. Not necessarily in a bad way. She was polite enough, articulate, and clearly intelligent. But there was something in her eyes when she looked around my home, a subtle evaluation that made me feel like I was being appraised. I tried to like her. I really did. When Daniel announced 3 months ago that they were engaged, I forced myself to smile and offer congratulations, even though something in my gut told me this was moving too fast. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I told myself I was being overprotective, that no woman would ever be good enough for my boy in my eyes, that I needed to trust Daniel's judgment and support his happiness. I bought an expensive bottle of champagne, hosted an engagement party in my backyard, and spent hours planning how I could help with wedding arrangements. The first real sign of trouble came during the engagement party planning. I had suggested serving some of Daniel's favorite foods: the lasagna I'd made for every birthday since he was 5, my grandmother's famous chocolate cake, and the spinach salad that had been our family's signature dish for decades. Cassandra listened politely, then gently suggested that we might want to consider more sophisticated options for their guests. She said it with a smile, but the implication was clear. My cooking wasn't good enough for her friends. I swallowed my hurt and hired a caterer who charged more for one evening than I typically spent on groceries in 3 months. The party was beautiful, elegant, and completely impersonal. Cassandra's friends complimented the presentation while barely touching the food, and I spent the evening feeling like a stranger in my own home. But I told myself it was one night, that compromise was part of building family relationships, that I was being too sensitive. The second incident happened a month later when Daniel brought Cassandra over to discuss wedding plans. I'd prepared a folder full of ideas. Venues I'd researched, caterers I'd called, florists who came highly recommended. I'd spent weeks putting together suggestions because I wanted to be helpful, to show that I was excited about their marriage and ready to support them however I could. Cassandra flipped through my carefully assembled materials with the kind of polite disinterest you'd show a child's art project. "These are sweet, Dotty," she said, using that particular tone that makes sweet sound like an insult. "But Daniel and I are really looking for something more modern, more current. You know how it is. Wedding trends change so quickly, and what was popular when you got married just isn't what couples want anymore. I married Richard in 1972, 51 years ago. The implication that my ideas were hopelessly outdated because of my age hit me like a physical blow, but I managed to keep smiling. Daniel didn't say anything to defend me, or acknowledge that his father and I had actually had a beautiful wedding that people still talked about decades later. He just nodded along as Cassandra explained that they'd already hired a wedding planner who specialized in, quote, contemporary celebrations. The third incident was smaller but somehow more painful. I'd given Cassandra a necklace that had belonged to my mother, a simple strand of pearls that had been in our family for 3 generations. It wasn't expensive by modern standards, but it carried the weight of family history and love. I thought she might want to wear it as her something old on the wedding day, a way of connecting her to our family's story. Cassandra accepted the necklace with appropriate gratitude, but the next week I saw her wearing a completely different pearl necklace to dinner, one that was clearly new and expensive. When I asked about my mother's pearls, she explained that she'd decided to update her jewelry collection and had traded them in at a high-end boutique for store credit toward pieces that better reflected her personal style. I felt like she'd slapped me. Those pearls had been my mother's most treasured possession, worn on her wedding day and passed down with the understanding that they would continue through our family line. Cassandra had treated them like outdated accessories to be discarded in favor of something more fashionable. When I tried to explain their sentimental value, she apologized profusely but made it clear that the transaction was final and she had no intention of retrieving them. Daniel's response to my distress was to suggest that I was being, quote, overly emotional about material objects, and that Cassandra had meant no disrespect. He pointed out that she'd thanked me graciously, and that the pearls were technically hers to do with as she pleased once I'd given them to her. Legally, he was right. Emotionally, I felt like my family's history had been casually erased. But none of these incidents prepared me for what happened last Tuesday. Daniel and Cassandra had come over for our usual family dinner, something we'd been doing every other week since their engagement. I'd spent the afternoon preparing pot roast with vegetables, homemade dinner rolls, and apple pie. Comfort food that Daniel had always loved, and that I hoped might help us feel more connected as a family. The dinner conversation was pleasant enough, focusing on their honeymoon plans and Daniel's recent promotion at work. After dinner, as I was serving dessert, Cassandra's phone rang. It was her mother, calling about some detail related to the wedding reception. Cassandra stepped out onto the patio to take the call, leaving Daniel and me alone in the dining room. I could hear her voice through the sliding glass door, animated and excited as she described their plans to her mother. "Oh, you should see Daniel's mother's house," Cassandra was saying, her voice carrying clearly through the evening air. "It's like stepping back in time. Everything is so outdated. The furniture, the decorations, even the way she entertains. She still uses cloth napkins and serves dinner on actual china, like we're living in the 1950s. It's actually kind of charming in a museum sort of way, but thank goodness we won't have to deal with that aesthetic once we're married." I felt the blood drain from my face. Daniel was looking down at his phone, apparently not hearing or not registering what his fiancée was saying about his childhood home, about the woman who'd raised him, about the life his father and I had built together. Cassandra continued talking, her voice gaining momentum as she warmed to her subject. She's a sweet old lady, don't get me wrong, but she has no sense of style whatsoever. The whole house feels like a time capsule from when she was young. I keep trying to gently suggest updates, but she's so set in her ways. Daniel says she's always been like that, resistant to change, stuck in the past. I guess that's just how people get when they're her age. Thank goodness Daniel doesn't have those same outdated sensibilities, or we'd never be able to build the kind of modern life we want together. The words hit me like a series of physical blows. Outdated, sweet old lady, stuck in the past, museum, time capsule. Each phrase felt carefully chosen to diminish everything I was and everything I'd built. This wasn't casual criticism. This was systematic demolition of my worth as a person, delivered with the casual cruelty that comes from absolute certainty that your opinion matters more than someone else's feelings. What made it worse was the way she talked about Daniel agreeing with her assessment. Daniel says she's always been like that. Had my son really described me as resistant to change and stuck in the past? Had he been complaining about me to his fiancée, giving her permission to view me as an outdated relic to be tolerated rather than respected? I stood in my dining room, surrounded by the furniture Richard and I had chosen together, the china we'd received as wedding gifts and cherished for 50 years, the family photos that documented decades of love and celebration, everything that represented my life's work, creating a warm, welcoming home where family could gather and feel connected to each other, had been dismissed as outdated and embarrassing. Cassandra finished her phone call and returned to the dining room with her usual bright smile, completely unaware that I'd overheard her devastating critique. She complimented my apple pie, asked for the recipe, and chatted about their upcoming weekend plans as if nothing had happened. Daniel remained focused on his phone, occasionally contributing to the conversation but clearly distracted by work emails or social media. I managed to get through the rest of the evening by going through the motions of normal social interaction. I smiled at appropriate moments, asked questions about their wedding preparations, and thanked them for coming to dinner. But inside, I felt like something fundamental had shifted. The relationship I thought I had with my future daughter-in-law, polite, respectful, gradually warming, had been revealed as a performance on her part. She saw me as an obligation to be managed, an embarrassment to be endured, a relic from a bygone era that had no relevance to her modern life. After they left, I sat alone in my outdated living room and cried for the first time since Richard's funeral. Not the gentle tears of sadness or frustration, but the ugly sobbing that comes from feeling fundamentally rejected by someone you've been trying to love. I looked around at my home with new eyes, trying to see it the way Cassandra did. Was it really so terrible? The furniture was well maintained and comfortable. The decorations reflected a lifetime of travel, family celebrations, and personal memories. The overall aesthetic was traditional, yes, but it was also warm and welcoming in a way that many modern homes weren't. More importantly, this house represented everything Richard and I had worked for. Every piece of furniture had been carefully chosen and saved for. Every room had been painted and decorated with love and attention to detail. Every family photo and memento had been placed with thought and care. This wasn't a museum or a time capsule. It was a home that had been lived in and loved in for decades. But as I sat there in the dark, I began to understand that the house wasn't really the issue. Cassandra's criticism of my outdated home was really criticism of me as a person. In her mind, I was a relic from a previous generation whose opinions, preferences, and way of life had no value in the modern world. I was something to be tolerated for Daniel's sake, not someone to be respected or included in their future. The realization was devastating, but it was also clarifying. For months, I'd been trying to build a relationship with Cassandra, bending over backward to accommodate her preferences and support her vision for her life with Daniel. I'd convinced myself that her coldness was just shyness, that her criticism was meant to be helpful, that her distance was simply a different communication style. But hearing her casual dismissal of everything I represented forced me to face the truth. She didn't respect me, and she never would. What hurt even more was Daniel's apparent complicity in this dynamic. My son, who I'd raised to value kindness and respect, had allowed his fiancée to view me as an embarrassment. He'd participated in conversations where my way of life was mocked and dismissed. He'd chosen to support her perspective rather than defend the woman who'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities and love. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered through my house, looking at everything with the strange double vision that comes from seeing familiar things through hostile eyes. The family room where Daniel had done homework every night throughout high school suddenly seemed cluttered with unnecessary furniture. The kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals for my family felt cramped and inefficient compared to the sleek, modern spaces featured in home design magazines. The formal dining room where we'd celebrated every important milestone in Daniel's life looked fussy and overly decorated. But then I forced myself to remember the real stories these rooms contained. The family room wasn't cluttered. It was comfortable, designed for actual living rather than magazine photography. The kitchen wasn't inefficient. It was functional, laid out by someone who actually cooked and understood how a workspace should flow. The dining room wasn't fussy. It was elegant, designed to make every meal feel like a celebration of family connection. As the hours passed, my hurt began transforming into something harder and more determined. I realized that I'd been approaching the situation all wrong. I had been trying to earn Cassandra's approval, to prove that I was worthy of inclusion in their modern life. But respect isn't something you earn by making yourself smaller. It's something you demand by refusing to accept less than you deserve. By dawn, I'd made a decision that would change everything. If Cassandra thought I was outdated, if she saw me as a relic with no relevance to their future, then perhaps it was time to show her exactly how much influence this sweet old lady actually had. I wasn't just Daniel's mother. I was also a woman of considerable means, with assets and resources that would significantly impact their comfortable future. Richard and I had been careful with money our entire lives. We'd saved diligently, invested wisely, and lived below our means so that we could provide security for our family and leave something meaningful for Daniel when we were gone. Our house was worth nearly $800,000 in today's market. Our Fiancée investment portfolio, built over decades of careful planning, was worth just over $1 million. Our life insurance policies and retirement accounts added another $400,000 to the total. All told, Daniel stood to inherit approximately $2.25 million when I died, money that would allow him and his future wife to pay off their mortgage, fund their children's education, and retire comfortably decades earlier than their peers. It was a legacy that represented a lifetime of sacrifice and careful planning, intended to give my son opportunities that Richard and I had never had. But legacies aren't automatic. They're choices made by people who have the power to decide how their resources will be distributed. And if Cassandra thought I was too outdated to deserve respect in life, perhaps she'd find out exactly how relevant I could be in death. I spent that Wednesday morning researching estate planning attorneys in Phoenix. I needed someone who specialized in complex family situations, someone who could help me understand all my options for restructuring my will and ensuring that my wishes would be honored. By noon, I had appointments scheduled with 3 different law firms for the following week. The interesting thing about money is that it has a way of clarifying relationships. When someone stands to inherit a significant sum, they tend to be more attentive to the person who controls that inheritance. When they're cut out of that inheritance, their true feelings become much more apparent. I was curious to see which version of Cassandra would emerge when she realized that her future financial security wasn't as guaranteed as she'd assumed. But before I made any irreversible decisions, I needed to understand exactly where Daniel stood in all of this. Was he truly complicit in Cassandra's disrespect, or was he simply oblivious to the dynamics playing out around him? Had he really described me as outdated and resistant to change? Or was Cassandra exaggerating his comments to justify her own cruelty? Most importantly, when forced to choose between supporting his fiancée's disrespect and honoring his mother, which side would my son take? I decided to give Daniel one opportunity to show me who he really was. I would tell him what I'd overheard, explain how it had made me feel, and see whether he responded with empathy and action or with excuses and deflection. His response would determine not just the future of our relationship, but the future of his inheritance as well. That evening, I called Daniel and asked him to come over for coffee the next day. I told him I had something important to discuss about family matters, which was true enough. He agreed to stop by after work on Thursday, sounding slightly concerned but not alarmed. I spent Wednesday night rehearsing what I would say, how I would give him every opportunity to do the right thing. Thursday evening arrived with the kind of perfect Arizona sunset that had always reminded me why Richard and I chose to make our lives here. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink that no artist could replicate, and the desert air carried the scent of blooming jasmine from my neighbor's yard. It should have been a peaceful, beautiful evening for a mother and son to have an honest conversation about family and respect. Daniel arrived at 6 o'clock, still wearing his work clothes but looking relaxed and happy. He hugged me warmly, complimented the coffee I'd made, and settled into his father's old chair in the living room with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd grown up in this space. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that everything could be worked out, that my son would hear my concerns and take action to address them. "Mom, you sounded kind of serious on the phone," Daniel said, accepting the cup of coffee I offered him. "Is everything okay? Are you feeling all right?" I took a deep breath and decided to approach the conversation directly but gently, giving him every benefit of the doubt. "I'm fine physically, sweetheart, but I need to talk to you about something that happened Tuesday night during dinner." Daniel's expression shifted to one of mild concern. "What about Tuesday night? I thought dinner went really well. Cassandra said she had a lovely time." "I'm sure she did," I said carefully, "but while she was on the phone with her mother, I overheard part of their conversation. She was describing our house, our dinner, our family time together." I paused, watching Daniel's face for any sign of recognition or concern. He looked puzzled but not particularly worried, which suggested he genuinely didn't know what was coming. "What did she say?" he asked. I repeated Cassandra's comments as accurately as I could remember them, watching my son's face as I described being called outdated, having our home compared to a museum, and being dismissed as a sweet old lady stuck in the past. With each phrase, Daniel's expression grew more uncomfortable, but I couldn't tell whether he was embarrassed by Cassandra's cruelty or simply uncomfortable with the conflict. When I finished, the living room fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock that had belonged to Richard's parents. Daniel stared down at his coffee cup, his jaw working as he processed what I'd told him. "Mom," he said finally, "I'm sorry you heard that. I'm sure Cassandra didn't mean for you to overhear, and I'm sure she didn't mean it the way it sounded." The response hit me like a bucket of cold water. Not, "I'm sorry she said those hurtful things." Not, "That was completely inappropriate, and I'll address it with her immediately. But I'm sorry you heard that, and I'm sure she didn't mean it that way." "Daniel," I said slowly, "she called me outdated. She compared our home to a museum. She said I have no sense of style and that I'm stuck in the past. She said you agree with her assessment. How exactly could I have misunderstood that?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, still not meeting my eyes. "Look, Mom, I think you might be taking this a little too personally. Cassandra comes from a different background, a different generation. She's used to more contemporary styles, more modern approaches to entertaining and home decoration. That doesn't mean she doesn't respect you. It just means she has different preferences." "Different preferences?" I felt my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "She said I was a sweet old lady with no sense of style. She said our home feels like a time capsule. She said you told her I was resistant to change and stuck in the past." "Those aren't preferences, Daniel. Those are insults." "Mom, please don't get upset." Daniel finally looked at me and I could see the conflict in his eyes. "I know Cassandra can be a little direct sometimes, but she's not trying to hurt your feelings. She's just being honest about her perspective." "And what about your perspective?" I asked. "Did you really tell her that I'm resistant to change and stuck in the past?" The pause before Daniel answered told me everything I needed to know. "I might have mentioned that you prefer traditional approaches to things," he said carefully, "but I didn't mean it as criticism. I was just explaining your personality, helping her understand how to connect with you. By describing me as outdated and set in my ways?" By explaining that you value tradition and stability, Daniel said, but his defensive tone suggested he knew the distinction was meaningless. I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. My son had chosen his side, and it wasn't mine. He was more concerned with defending his fiancée's cruelty than with addressing my hurt. He was more interested in minimizing the conflict than in standing up for basic respect. Daniel, I said quietly, I need you to understand something. The way Cassandra talks about me, about our home, about our family, it's not okay. It's disrespectful and hurtful, and the fact that you're enabling it makes it worse. I'm not enabling anything, Daniel protested. I'm just trying to keep the peace. Cassandra is going to be my wife, and you're my mother. I need both relationships to work. And what happens when those relationships require different things from you? What happens when keeping the peace with Cassandra means allowing her to disrespect me? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with the implications of my question. Finally, he spoke in the tone of someone who'd made a difficult decision. Mom, I love you. You know that. But I also love Cassandra, and I'm going to marry her. I need you to find a way to get along with her, to accept that she's different from you, but that doesn't make her wrong. I need you to try harder to build a relationship with her, instead of focusing on every little thing she says that might be taken the wrong way. The words hit me like a physical blow. I was the one who needed to try harder. I was the one focusing on little things that might be taken the wrong way. After being called outdated and dismissed as irrelevant, I was being asked to work harder to earn respect from someone who'd already made it clear she had no intention of giving it. I see, I said, setting down my coffee cup with steady hands despite the trembling I felt inside. And if I can't find a way to accept being disrespected in my own home, if I can't find a way to smile and pretend I don't mind being called outdated and stuck in the past? Daniel's face hardened slightly, and for the first time in our conversation, I saw a flash of the man Cassandra was marrying, someone willing to sacrifice family loyalty for personal convenience. Then I guess we'll have to agree to disagree, he said. But I'm not going to let you make me choose between my mother and my fiancé. I'm going to marry Cassandra whether you approve or not. I never asked you to choose between us, I said quietly. I asked you to stand up for basic respect, but I can see that's not going to happen. Daniel stood up, clearly ready to end a conversation that had become uncomfortable for him. Mom, I hope you'll think about what I've said. Cassandra is going to be part of our family, and fighting with her isn't going to change that. The sooner you accept that and find a way to build a positive relationship with her, the happier everyone will be. After he left, I sat alone in my living room as the sunset faded into darkness. The conversation had confirmed my worst fears about where I stood in my son's priorities. Daniel was willing to enable Cassandra's disrespect as long as it kept his own life comfortable. He expected me to tolerate being diminished and insulted, because addressing the problem would require him to have difficult conversations with his fiancée. That night, I made the phone calls that would change everything. I scheduled my appointment with the estate planning attorney for the following Monday. I began researching charities and organizations that reflected my values and would make good use of the inheritance I'd been planning to leave to Daniel. And I started planning exactly how I would reveal my decision to my son and his future wife. If Cassandra thought I was too outdated to deserve respect, she was about to discover just how much power this sweet old lady actually possessed. The weekend passed in a haze of forced normalcy that felt like walking through someone else's life. I went through my usual routines. Grocery shopping at the Fry's, where I'd been a customer for 20 years, tending to my rose garden that Richard had helped me plant, attending Sunday service at the Methodist church where Daniel had been baptized. But everything felt different now, filtered through the lens of my new understanding about where I actually stood in my son's life. Saturday morning brought Mrs. Henderson from next door, stopping by with a plate of her famous snickerdoodles and the kind of neighborhood gossip that usually made me smile. At 81, Eleanor Henderson had been my closest friend since Richard and I moved into this house, and she possessed the rare gift of being genuinely interested in other people's lives without being judgmental about their choices. "You look tired, dear," she said, settling into the kitchen chair that had become hers over the years of our friendship. "Everything all right with Daniel and that pretty fiancée of his?" The innocent question hit me harder than I'd expected. Eleanor had been present for every major milestone in Daniel's life: birthday parties, graduation celebrations, his promotion announcements. She'd watched him grow from an awkward 12-year-old into a successful man, and she'd always been genuinely proud of his achievements. The idea of explaining how drastically our relationship had shifted felt overwhelming. "Things are complicated right now," I said carefully, pouring coffee into the delicate china cups that Cassandra had probably classified as hopelessly outdated. "Wedding planning brings out different perspectives in people." Eleanor's sharp blue eyes studied my face with the kind of perception that comes from decades of friendship. Different perspectives or different values? The distinction was so precise that I almost started crying right there at my kitchen table. Eleanor had always been able to cut through polite euphemisms and identify the heart of any situation. Different perspectives suggested minor disagreements about preferences or approaches. Different values suggested fundamental incompatibilities about what mattered most in life. Different values, I admitted, and saying it out loud made the reality feel more concrete and irreversible. "Oh, honey," Eleanor said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand with fingers that were still strong despite their age. "What happened?" I found myself telling her everything: the engagement party catering situation, the dismissed wedding suggestions, the traded family pearls, and finally the devastating phone conversation I'd overheard. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. When I finished with Daniel's response to my concerns, she sat back in her chair and shook her head slowly. "That girl doesn't just disrespect you," Eleanor said with the bluntness that made her such a valuable friend. "She disrespects everything you represent: your history, your values, your way of building relationships. And Daniel's allowing it because confronting it would be inconvenient for him." "But maybe I am being too sensitive," I said, voicing the doubt that had been plaguing me since Thursday night. "Maybe my expectations are unrealistic. Maybe this is just how modern relationships work, and I'm too old-fashioned to understand the dynamics." Eleanor's expression shifted to one of gentle exasperation. "Dorothy Chen, I have known you for 36 years, and in all that time I have never seen you be unreasonable about anything important. You welcomed every girlfriend Daniel ever brought home. You hosted birthday parties for children whose names you could barely pronounce. You've spent decades making other people comfortable in your space, and you've never once demanded that they change their fundamental nature to accommodate you." She paused to sip her coffee, giving weight to her next words. "But demanding respect isn't the same as demanding change. Expecting basic courtesy isn't old-fashioned, it's human decency. And anyone who thinks your values are outdated doesn't understand what values actually are." The conversation with Eleanor crystallized something I'd been struggling to articulate even to myself. This wasn't about generational differences or conflicting aesthetic preferences. This was about respect, specifically about whether I was willing to accept a relationship based on the premise that my thoughts, feelings, and preferences were inherently less valid than those of someone younger and more fashionable. After Eleanor left, I spent the rest of Saturday afternoon in my garden, pulling weeds and deadheading roses while my mind churned through years of memories. I thought about the way Richard and I had navigated disagreements throughout our marriage, always with the underlying assumption that both perspectives had value and deserved consideration. I thought about the way I'd raised Daniel, teaching him that kindness and respect weren't old-fashioned concepts but timeless foundations for any meaningful relationship. I remembered a conversation Daniel and I had when he was 16, after he'd been dismissive toward one of his teachers who'd grown up in a different era and had different teaching methods than the younger faculty members. I'd explained to him that wisdom and experience weren't diminished by age, that different approaches weren't automatically inferior approaches, and that learning to value perspectives outside his own generation would make him a better person throughout his life. "People aren't disposable just because they do things differently than you do," I'd told him. "And someone isn't wrong just because they represent values or traditions that feel unfamiliar to you. The mark of true sophistication is being able to appreciate quality and wisdom regardless of the package it comes in." He'd listened thoughtfully, nodded seriously, and applied that lesson to his relationships with teachers, employers, and family members for years afterward. The irony that he was now allowing his fiancée to violate every principle I'd taught him was almost unbearable. Sunday brought its own revelations. During the coffee hour after church service, I found myself observing the interactions between the younger and older congregation members with new attention. I watched how Sarah Mitchell, a woman in her 30s with 2 small children, genuinely sought advice from Mary Rodriguez, whose grandchildren were now adults. I noticed how Tom Bradley, barely out of college, listened respectfully when Frank Watson shared stories about his military service and early career. These weren't interactions based on obligation or politeness. They were genuine connections between people who recognized that age and experience had value, that different generations could learn from each other, that respect flowed both ways regardless of who was older or younger. The contrast with Cassandra's attitude toward me was stark and painful. I realized that I'd been unconsciously apologizing for my age, my preferences, and my way of life in a desperate attempt to earn acceptance from someone who'd already decided I wasn't worth respecting. I'd been trying to prove that I was still relevant, still worthy of consideration, still deserving of basic courtesy. But respect isn't something you earn by diminishing yourself. It's something you command by refusing to accept less than you deserve. Sunday evening brought an unexpected phone call from my sister Margaret, who lived in Seattle with her husband of 47 years. We talked every few weeks, but something in my voice must have alerted her that things weren't quite right. "You sound different, Dotty," she said after we'd exchanged the usual updates about health, weather, and neighborhood news. "Strained. What's going on?" Margaret was 3 years older than me and had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect when something was wrong in my life. When we were children, she'd known about my crushes, my fears, and my disappointments before I'd fully acknowledged them myself. As adults, she'd sensed Richard's illness months before we'd received the official diagnosis. And she'd called to check on me the day before Daniel's accident in high school that had resulted in a broken arm and a totaled car. I found myself telling her the whole story, from the engagement party through the overheard phone conversation to Daniel's disappointing response. Margaret listened with the kind of attention that made me remember why phone calls with her always felt like conversations with my closest friend, rather than just family obligation. "That little witch," Margaret said when I finished, using language that would have scandalized our mother but that perfectly captured my own feelings. "And Daniel's response was to tell you to try harder to accommodate her disrespect? What kind of man did you raise?" "The kind who's forgotten where he came from," I said, surprising myself with the bitterness in my voice. "Or the kind who's never had to face real consequences for prioritizing his own comfort over other people's dignity," Margaret replied. "Dotty, do you remember what happened with James when he started dating that awful woman who was rude to me and Mom?" I did remember. Margaret's son James had briefly dated a woman who'd made snide comments about Margaret's cooking, criticized their family traditions, and treated Margaret and their mother like embarrassing relics from a bygone era. The relationship had lasted exactly as long as it took Margaret to make it clear that disrespecting his family meant losing access to family support, both emotional and financial. "What did you do exactly?" I asked, though I remembered the broad outlines of the situation. "I told him that any woman who couldn't treat his family with basic respect wasn't welcome in our home, and any son who allowed his mother to be disrespected wasn't getting the down payment help we'd been planning to give him for his first house," Margaret said matter-of-factly. "It took him exactly 1 week to decide that maybe she wasn't as wonderful as he'd thought. And if he'd chosen her over family, then he would have learned that choices have consequences, and treating your mother like garbage has expensive consequences," Margaret replied. But he didn't choose her, because when faced with the reality of what his priorities would cost him, he realized his priorities were wrong. The conversation stayed with me long after we hung up. Margaret had faced a similar situation, and had handled it by making the consequences of disrespect clear and immediate. She hadn't tried to earn respect through accommodation or compromise. She demanded it by showing that disrespect came with a real price. Monday morning, I dressed carefully for my appointment with the estate planning attorney. I chose a navy blue suit that Richard had always said made me look distinguished, paired with the pearl earrings my mother had given me from my college graduation. If I was going to discuss restructuring my legacy, I wanted to look like a woman who understood the weight of such decisions. The law offices of Morrison, Bradley and Associates occupied the entire 14th floor of a downtown Phoenix high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered spectacular views of the surrounding desert. The reception area was decorated in the kind of understated elegance that suggested both competence and discretion, exactly what I needed for this type of sensitive family matter. Patricia Morrison turned out to be a woman in her early 60s with silver hair, intelligent eyes, and the kind of calm competence that comes from handling complex family situations for decades. Her office was filled with law books, family photos, and the subtle indicators of professional success earned through genuine expertise rather than flashy marketing. "Mrs. Chen," she said, gesturing for me to take a seat in one of the comfortable leather chairs arranged around a small conference table. "I understand you're interested in updating your estate planning documents. Can you tell me a bit about your current situation and what changes you're considering?" I explained my family structure: one son, no other children, a significant estate that currently designated Daniel as the primary beneficiary. I described my comfortable financial situation and my desire to ensure that my legacy reflected my values and supported causes I believed in. I was careful to avoid emotional language or personal grievances, focusing instead on practical considerations and long-term planning goals. Patricia listened thoughtfully, occasionally asking clarifying questions about asset values, existing legal documents, and my overall objectives. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with the kind of careful attention that made me feel truly heard. "Mrs. Chen, estate planning often involves complex family dynamics," she said carefully. "Can you help me understand what's prompting these changes? Are you concerned about your son's financial responsibility, his marriage plans, some other factor that's influenced your thinking?" The question was professionally phrased but emotionally direct. Patricia Morrison had clearly dealt with family conflicts that played out through inheritance decisions, and she was trying to understand whether my motivations were based on sound planning principles or emotional reactions that I might later regret. "My son is marrying a woman who has made it clear that she views me and my values as outdated and irrelevant," I said, choosing my words carefully. "He has chosen to support her perspective rather than address her disrespect. I want to ensure that my legacy goes to people and organizations that actually value what I've worked to build throughout my life." Patricia nodded slowly, and I could see her mental wheels turning as she processed the implications of what I'd said. "Have you discussed these concerns with your son? Does he understand that his inheritance might be affected by these relationship dynamics?" "He's aware of my concerns about his fiancée's attitude toward me," I replied. His response was to suggest that I need to try harder to accommodate her preferences and accept that she has different values than I do. He seems to believe that I should be grateful for whatever level of tolerance she's willing to show me. "I see," Patricia said, and something in her tone suggested that she'd dealt with similar situations before. "Mrs. Chen, I want to make sure you understand that estate planning decisions made during times of family conflict can be legally challenged, especially if there's evidence that you were unduly influenced by temporary emotional situations. Before we proceed with any major changes, I'd recommend taking some time to consider whether your current feelings reflect permanent changes in your relationship with your son, or reactions to immediate stressors that might resolve themselves." It was sound advice, delivered with the kind of professional caution that protected both client and attorney from impulsive decisions that could create legal complications later. But it also revealed that Patricia didn't fully understand the depth of what had shifted in my relationship with Daniel. "Ms. Morrison," I said, "this isn't about a temporary disagreement or a moment of hurt feelings. This is about discovering that my son is willing to enable ongoing disrespect as long as it doesn't inconvenience him personally. That's not a temporary character flaw. That's a fundamental revelation about his priorities and values." Patricia was quiet for a moment, apparently recognizing the weight of what I'd said. "All right. If you're certain about moving forward, what specific changes are you considering?" I outlined my preliminary thoughts: reducing Daniel's inheritance significantly, establishing charitable trusts that reflected my values, and creating mechanisms that would require any beneficiary to demonstrate genuine respect for my memory and legacy. Patricia took detailed notes, asked thoughtful questions, and explained the legal requirements for implementing each type of change I was considering. One option that might interest you, she said toward the end of our consultation, is a conditional inheritance structure. You could maintain your son as the primary beneficiary, but establish specific requirements that must be met for him to access the full inheritance. For example, requiring participation in family counseling, demonstrated respect for family relationships, or other behavioral conditions that reflect your values. The suggestion was intriguing because it offered Daniel an opportunity to earn his inheritance through changed behavior, rather than simply losing it due to current behavior. It would give him a chance to recognize the consequences of his choices and decide whether he was willing to prioritize respect for family relationships over his fiancée's comfort. What would that look like practically? I asked. You could establish a timeline, say 1 year from your death, during which your son would need to demonstrate specific behaviors or achievements to access his full inheritance, Patricia explained. For instance, completing family counseling, ending relationships with people who disrespect family values, or showing sustained commitment to honoring your memory and legacy. If the conditions aren't met, the inheritance goes to your designated charitable organizations instead. The more I thought about it, the more the conditional approach appealed to me. It would send a clear message about my expectations, without completely cutting Daniel out of my legacy. It would give him time to realize the cost of his current choices and make different decisions if he chose to. Most importantly, it would ensure that my money didn't go to support a lifestyle built on disrespecting everything I'd worked to create. By the time I left Patricia Morrison's office, I had a clear plan for restructuring my estate in ways that reflected my values and sent unmistakable messages about the consequences of taking family relationships for granted. I felt calmer and more purposeful than I had since the devastating dinner conversation the previous week. Tuesday evening brought another family dinner invitation from Daniel, delivered via text message with the casual expectation that I would, of course, be available to cook for him and Cassandra again. The assumption that I would continue hosting them after what had happened between us revealed just how completely Daniel had missed the significance of our conversation. Instead of responding immediately, I spent Tuesday evening writing in the journal I'd started keeping after Richard's death. Writing had always helped me process difficult emotions and clarify my thinking, and I found that putting my thoughts on paper made them feel more real and actionable. I wrote about the conversation with Eleanor and how her clarity had helped me understand that my expectations weren't unreasonable. I wrote about the church coffee hour and the respectful intergenerational relationships I had observed there. I wrote about Margaret's advice and her successful handling of a similar situation with James. I wrote about the meeting with Patricia Morrison and the options I was considering for restructuring my legacy. Most importantly, I wrote about the shift in my own thinking that had occurred over the past few days. I was no longer asking myself how I could earn respect from Cassandra and Daniel. Instead, I was asking myself what consequences their disrespect should carry, and how I could implement those consequences effectively. The change in perspective was liberating. Instead of feeling like a victim of their cruelty, I felt like a woman with options and the power to implement them. Instead of hoping they would spontaneously develop better character, I was planning to show them that character failures carried real costs. Instead of accepting whatever treatment they were willing to offer, I was deciding what treatment I was willing to accept. Wednesday morning, I finally responded to Daniel's dinner invitation. Instead of the automatic acceptance he'd expected, I sent a carefully worded text message that would begin preparing him for what was coming. Daniel, I won't be available for dinner this week. I'm taking some time to think about family relationships and what I want them to look like going forward. I'll be in touch when I'm ready to discuss some important matters with you and Cassandra. His response came within minutes, revealing just how unexpected my boundary setting had been. Mom, are you okay? What important matters? Is this about last week's conversation? I thought we'd worked that out. The assumption that we'd worked out our disagreement by me accepting his dismissal of my concerns was so typical of Daniel's current approach to conflict that I almost laughed. He genuinely seemed to believe that his explanation of why I should tolerate disrespect had resolved the underlying problem. We'll discuss it soon, I replied, and then I turned off my phone for the rest of the day. I spent Wednesday afternoon visiting 3 different charitable organizations that I was considering, including in my revised estate plan. The first was a literacy program that helped adults learn to read and write, staffed largely by volunteers over 60, who understood that wisdom and experience were valuable resources. The second was a scholarship fund for first-generation college students whose families had sacrificed to give them educational opportunities. The third was a hospice program that provided comfort and dignity to people in their final days, recognizing that every life had value regardless of age or current capacity. Each organization impressed me with their genuine commitment to values I shared: respect for individual worth, appreciation for sacrifice and service, understanding that people deserve dignity regardless of their circumstances. The contrast with Cassandra's attitude toward anyone she deemed outdated or irrelevant was stark and clarifying. By Thursday morning, I had made my final decisions about how to restructure my estate and what messages I wanted those changes to send. I called Patricia Morrison to schedule a follow-up appointment for the following week, when I would sign the new documents that would fundamentally alter Daniel's financial future. But first, I was going to give my son and his fiancée one final opportunity to understand exactly what their choices had cost them. I was going to have the conversation that would either mark the beginning of genuine change in our relationship or serve as the formal end of my role as the accommodating mother who absorbed disrespect for the sake of family peace. The game was about to change, and it was time for Daniel and Cassandra to learn that this outdated grandmother still had moves they hadn't anticipated. Friday afternoon, I invited Daniel and Cassandra to dinner at my house for what I decided would be our final family meal under the old rules of engagement. The invitation was carefully worded to sound like a peace offering, a home-cooked dinner where we could clear the air and move forward as a family. They accepted immediately, probably relieved that I seemed to be returning to my familiar role as the accommodating mother who swept uncomfortable truths under the rug for the sake of family harmony. I spent Friday morning preparing what had always been Daniel's favorite meal: herb-crusted pork tenderloin with roasted vegetables, garlic mashed potatoes, and homemade apple crisp for dessert. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was cooking an elaborate, outdated meal for people who'd dismissed my approach to hospitality as hopelessly old-fashioned. But this dinner wasn't really about the food. It was about creating the perfect setting for a conversation that would change everything. I set the dining room table with my best china, the crystal glasses Richard and I had received as wedding gifts, and the silver candlesticks that had belonged to his grandmother. If Cassandra thought my aesthetic was museum-worthy, I wanted to give her the full exhibition. Every element of the table setting represented decades of family history and careful curation, and I wanted that history to be visibly present for what was coming. They arrived at 6 o'clock sharp, Daniel looking handsome in his weekend casual clothes, and Cassandra wearing a flowing sundress that probably cost more than I typically spent on clothing in 6 months. She complimented my table setting with the kind of polite enthusiasm that had once made me think she was warming up to me, but now sounded condescending and performative. "Dotty, this looks absolutely lovely," she said, running her finger along the edge of one of the crystal glasses. "So formal and traditional. It's like something out of a period movie." The comment contained the same subtle dismissiveness I'd learned to recognize. Praise that was actually criticism. Compliments that highlighted exactly what the speaker found outdated or excessive. Daniel either didn't notice the underlying message or chose to ignore it, focusing instead on the familiar smells of his favorite foods. "Mom, this smells incredible," he said, hugging me warmly. "You really went all out tonight. What's the occasion?" "Family," I said simply. Sometimes it's important to mark occasions properly, to create the right atmosphere for meaningful conversations. We made pleasant small talk through the first course, discussing the unusually mild October weather, Daniel's latest work project, and Cassandra's recent promotion at the real estate company. The conversation flowed easily, with none of the tension that had characterized our recent interactions. For a few minutes, I almost allowed myself to imagine that we could have a peaceful resolution to our conflicts. But then Cassandra's phone rang, and she glanced at the screen with obvious annoyance. "Oh, it's my mother again. She's been calling all week about the wedding details. You'd think she was planning her own wedding instead of mine." She declined the call and set her phone aside, but the interruption shifted the conversational dynamic in ways that revealed her true feelings about family obligations and older women's involvement in their children's lives. I love my mother dearly, Cassandra continued, apparently not recognizing the irony of her words. But she has such outdated ideas about weddings. She keeps suggesting things that might have been elegant 30 years ago, but just feel so dated now. I keep trying to explain that modern couples want something fresh and contemporary, not some throwback to how things used to be done. The parallel to her attitude toward me was so obvious that I wondered if she was deliberately baiting me, or if she was genuinely oblivious to her own patterns of dismissing older women's perspectives. Daniel continued eating, apparently unbothered by his fiancée's casual dismissal of maternal input as inherently outdated. "What kind of suggestions is she making?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Oh, traditional things," Cassandra said with a wave of her hand. "She wants us to have a formal sit-down dinner instead of a cocktail reception. She thinks we should include more family traditions in the ceremony. She keeps pushing for things like a receiving line and formal dancing. She doesn't understand that today's couples want more relaxed, personalized celebrations." I noticed that every suggestion Cassandra's mother had made, formal dining, family traditions, receiving lines, were exactly the types of things I might have suggested if I'd been included in the wedding planning process. The realization that both mothers were being dismissed for valuing the same traditional approaches to celebrating family milestones crystallized my understanding of how Cassandra viewed anyone who didn't share her vision of modern sophistication. "Have you considered that some traditional elements might actually enhance your wanted celebration rather than dating it?" I asked carefully. "Sometimes the reason certain customs persist is because they serve important purposes, like helping people feel included and honored." Cassandra's smile became noticeably more strained. "Well, I suppose that's a matter of perspective. Daniel and I prefer to focus on what feels authentic to us, rather than what previous generations expected. We want our wedding to reflect who we are as a couple, not who our parents were as couples." The dismissal was polite, but unmistakable. Previous generations, including mine, were being characterized as irrelevant to modern authentic expression. Our preferences, our wisdom, our understanding of what made celebrations meaningful, all of it was being discarded as outdated baggage that enlightened modern couples had evolved beyond. Daniel finally looked up from his dinner, sensing some tension in the conversation. "Mom, we value your input," he said in the tone of someone trying to diffuse potential conflict. "It's just that Cassandra and I have pretty specific ideas about what we want our wedding to be like." "Of course you do," I replied. "And I respect your right to make those decisions. I'm just curious about how you decide which perspectives to value and which ones to dismiss." The question hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Cassandra's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and Daniel's expression shifted from casual contentment to wary attention. Both of them seemed to recognize that we'd moved beyond polite dinner conversation into more dangerous territory. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean," Cassandra said carefully. "I mean that you seem very quick to characterize anything traditional or generational as outdated," I said, setting down my own fork and giving her my full attention. "Your mother's suggestions are outdated. My home decor is outdated. My approach to entertaining is outdated. I'm curious about what makes something outdated versus what makes it timeless or valuable." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mom, I think you might be reading too much into casual conversation." "Am I?" I asked, turning to face him directly. "Because last Tuesday evening, I heard Cassandra describing our home and our family traditions to her mother. She used words like outdated, time capsule, and museum-worthy to describe everything about our life here. She said I had no sense of style and that I was stuck in the past. She said you agreed with her assessment." The silence that followed was deafening. Cassandra's face went pale, and I could see her mind racing as she tried to remember exactly what she'd said and how much I might have overheard. Daniel stared at his plate, clearly caught between loyalty to his fiancée and recognition that her words had been genuinely hurtful. "Dotty, Cassandra began, but I held up my hand to stop her. "I'm not finished," I said calmly. When I spoke to Daniel about what I'd heard, His response was to tell me that I needed to try harder to accommodate your different perspective. He suggested that I was being too sensitive and that I should work harder to build a relationship with you. At no point did either of you acknowledge that calling someone outdated and dismissing their entire way of life might be hurtful or inappropriate. Cassandra's composure cracked slightly, revealing the calculation behind her usual polished exterior. Dotty, I never meant for you to hear that conversation. I was just talking to my mother about different decorating styles and generational preferences. I wasn't trying to hurt your feelings. But you were trying to hurt my feelings, I said quietly. Or at least you were expressing your genuine belief that everything about me is outdated and irrelevant. The fact that you didn't expect me to hear it doesn't make the sentiment less real. Daniel finally found his voice, though it came out strained and defensive. Mom, can we please not do this? Cassandra apologized for any misunderstanding. Can't we just move forward? Apologized? I repeated. She apologized for my overhearing her true feelings, not for having those feelings in the first place. That's not an apology, Daniel. That's damage control. Cassandra's mask slipped further, revealing flashes of irritation and entitlement that she'd previously kept hidden. Look, Dotty, I'm sorry if I said things that upset you, but honestly, we do have different tastes and different approaches to things. That doesn't make either of us wrong. It just makes us different. You're absolutely right, I agreed. Having different tastes doesn't make either of us wrong. But dismissing my tastes as outdated and irrelevant while expecting me to respect and accommodate yours, that makes you wrong. The distinction was sharp and clear, and I could see both Daniel and Cassandra struggling to find a way to argue with its logic. They wanted to maintain the comfortable fiction that this was about aesthetic differences rather than basic respect. I think you're overreacting, Cassandra said, her voice taking on an edge that revealed her growing frustration with having to navigate this conversation. I never said anything about not respecting you. I just expressed a preference for more contemporary approaches to things. By calling my home a museum and suggesting that I'm stuck in the past, I replied. By trading my mother's pearls for something more suited to your personal style. By dismissing every suggestion I made about your wedding as outdated before you'd even considered whether it might have value. Each example hit its mark, and I could see Cassandra's carefully maintained composure beginning to fracture. She'd operated under the assumption that her subtle disrespect would go unchallenged, that I would continue absorbing her condescension without ever directly confronting its implications. Those pearls were mine to do with as I pleased once you gave them to me, she said, her tone becoming more defensive. And I did consider your wedding suggestions. I just decided they weren't right for our vision. Our vision, I repeated. And Daniel, what's your vision for how your future wife treats your mother? The question forced Daniel to choose sides in a way he'd been desperately trying to avoid. He could continue enabling Cassandra's disrespect, or he could acknowledge that her behavior toward me was unacceptable. The pause before his answer told me everything I needed to know about which direction he was leaning. Mom, I think both of you have valid points, he said finally, trying to find middle ground where none existed. Maybe we can all agree to be more sensitive to each other's feelings going forward. The diplomatic non-answer was exactly what I'd expected from Daniel, and exactly what confirmed that he was more committed to avoiding conflict than addressing its underlying causes. He wanted peace without justice, harmony without accountability, relationship without respect. Daniel, I said quietly, I'm not interested in managing each other's feelings. I'm interested in establishing basic standards for how family members treat each other. And those standards include not calling each other outdated, not dismissing each other's values as irrelevant, and not trading family heirlooms for store credit. Cassandra's patience finally snapped completely. Fine, you want honesty? Yes, I think your decorating style is outdated. Yes, I think your approach to entertaining feels formal and old-fashioned. Yes, I think some of your ideas about weddings and relationships come from a different era. But that doesn't mean I don't respect you as a person. Actually, that's exactly what it means, I replied calmly. When you dismiss someone's choices, their aesthetics, their traditions, and their way of life as outdated, you're dismissing them. When you make unilateral decisions about family heirlooms based on your personal preferences, you're showing contempt for family history and the people who created it. The conversation had reached the point of no return. All pretense of polite disagreement had been stripped away, revealing the fundamental incompatibility between Cassandra's sense of entitlement and my expectations of respect. She genuinely believed that being young and fashionable gave her the right to judge and dismiss everything that didn't conform to her standards. "And Daniel," I continued, turning to face my son directly, "when you enable and excuse that kind of treatment, you become complicit in it. When you tell me to try harder to accommodate someone who's already decided I'm not worth respecting, you're choosing her comfort over my dignity." Daniel's face flushed with a mixture of guilt and resentment. "That's not fair, Mom. I'm trying to build a life with Cassandra, and I need my family to support that. I can't have you constantly criticizing her or making her feel unwelcome." "I'm not asking you to choose between your mother and your fiancé," I said. "I'm asking you to choose between enabling disrespect and demanding basic courtesy. Those aren't the same thing." But Daniel had already made his choice, and it wasn't the one I'd hoped for. His priority was maintaining his comfortable relationship with Cassandra, even if that meant sacrificing his responsibility to stand up for basic decency. He wanted me to be the one who adjusted, accommodated, and absorbed whatever treatment Cassandra was willing to offer. "Look," Cassandra said, apparently deciding that the conversation had gone on long enough, "I'm sorry you feel disrespected. That wasn't my intention. But I can't change who I am or what I prefer, just to make you more comfortable. Daniel and I are building our own life together, and that life is going to reflect our values and our aesthetic choices." The finality in her tone made it clear that she considered the matter closed. She'd offered what she believed was sufficient acknowledgement of my concerns, and now she expected us to return to the previous dynamic where I accepted whatever level of consideration she was willing to provide. "You're absolutely right," I said, standing up from the table with a calmness that surprised even me. "You can't change who you are, and you shouldn't have to. But you also shouldn't expect to receive financial support from someone whose values and aesthetic choices you find so contemptible." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of shock and confusion that spread across both their faces. They'd expected tears, arguments, or eventual capitulation. They hadn't expected calm statements about financial consequences. "What do you mean?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with sudden concern. "I mean that I've been reconsidering my estate planning," I replied, beginning to clear the dinner plates with steady hands. "It seems foolish to leave my money to people who think everything I've worked to build is outdated and irrelevant. Better to support organizations that actually value the principles I've spent my life practicing." The silence that followed was charged with new understanding. Daniel and Cassandra were finally beginning to grasp that their treatment of me might carry costs they hadn't anticipated. For the first time since their engagement, they were considering the possibility that my feelings and my financial decisions might be connected. "Mom, you can't be serious," Daniel said, his voice cracking slightly. "You're talking about changing your will because of a misunderstanding about decorating preferences?" "I'm talking about changing my will because I've learned that my son is willing to let his fiancée disrespect his mother rather than risk an uncomfortable conversation," I replied. "I'm talking about ensuring that my legacy goes to people who actually appreciate the values of respect, kindness, and family loyalty that I've tried to live by." Cassandra's face had gone completely white. "Dotty, please, I think we've all said things tonight that we don't really mean. Can't we just start over?" "I meant every word I said," I replied. "And I suspect you did too. The only difference is that now you understand. There might be consequences for treating family members as disposable." The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. Suddenly, I wasn't the one seeking approval or accommodation. I was the one with the power to determine what their financial future would look like, and they were the ones scrambling to repair a relationship they'd taken for granted. But it was too late for desperate attempts at damage control. The words had been spoken, the attitudes had been revealed, and the consequences were already in motion. Whether they realized it or not, Daniel and Cassandra had just attended their last dinner as my presumptive heirs. The weekend following our explosive dinner passed in a flurry of phone calls, desperate text messages, and increasingly frantic attempts by Daniel and Cassandra to arrange another meeting. I let each call go to voicemail, each text remain unanswered for hours, each email sit in my inbox while I went about my normal weekend routine with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. Saturday morning brought 3 voicemails from Daniel, each one more desperate than the last. The first was casual, suggesting we talk through our misunderstanding from Friday night. The second was concerned, asking if I was feeling well and whether I needed anything. The third was panicked, begging me to call him back because he was worried about me and needed to know I was okay. I was more than okay. I was liberated. For the first time since Daniel's engagement, I felt like myself again. Not the diminished version of myself that had been trying to earn approval from people who'd already decided I wasn't worth respecting. I spent Saturday morning tending to my rose garden, something I'd neglected while focusing all my emotional energy on family drama. The physical act of pruning dead growth and nurturing healthy blooms felt symbolic of what I was doing in my own life. Eleanor Henderson appeared at my garden gate around 10 o'clock. Carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd been watching neighborhood drama unfold from her kitchen window. "That was quite a bit of activity at your place Friday night," she said, settling into one of my patio chairs with the comfortable familiarity of decades of friendship. "I saw Daniel's car leave around 9, and both he and that pretty fiancée of his looked like they'd seen a ghost." I accepted the coffee she offered and settled into the chair beside her, feeling grateful for a friend who understood that sometimes the most supportive thing you could do was provide companionship without demanding explanations. I told them some truths they weren't prepared to hear, I said simply. Eleanor's eyes sparkled with interest. The kind of truths that make people reconsider their behavior, or the kind that make them double down on their mistakes? Time will tell, I replied, though I suspected I already knew the answer. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the desert finches that frequented my backyard feeders. The October morning was perfect, crisp enough to be refreshing but warm enough to sit outside in comfort. It was the kind of day that reminded me why Richard and I had chosen Arizona for our retirement years, and why I'd stayed here even after his death. "Dorothy," Eleanor said eventually, "I've known you long enough to recognize when you've made a decision that changes everything. What are you planning to do?" The question was direct enough to require an honest answer, and Eleanor had earned the right to honesty through years of loyal friendship. I told her about my meetings with Patricia Morrison, my plans to restructure my estate, and my decision to establish charitable trusts that would reflect my values instead of supporting people who dismissed them. Eleanor listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as I explained my reasoning. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and smiled with genuine admiration. "It's about time," she said firmly. "That girl has been disrespecting you for months, and Daniel's been enabling it because confronting her would be inconvenient for him. Maybe losing $1 million inheritance will help him remember what his mother actually means to him." The casual mention of the dollar amount made me realize that Eleanor understood the practical implications of my decision better than Daniel and Cassandra probably did. They'd been so focused on their wedding plans and their future together that they'd likely never calculated exactly what Daniel stood to inherit when I died. Sunday brought a different type of communication from my son. Instead of voicemails, he sent a carefully worded email that read like something he'd drafted and redrafted multiple times before sending. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation Friday night, and I realize that maybe I haven't been as sensitive to your feelings as I should have been. Cassandra and I would like to take you to lunch today to talk through some of the issues that came up and find a way to move forward that makes everyone comfortable. Please let me know what time works for you." The email was revealing in several ways. First, Daniel was now initiating contact instead of waiting for me to reach out to him, a reversal of our usual dynamic that suggested he was beginning to understand the stakes involved. Second, he was acknowledging that he hadn't been sensitive to my feelings, which was closer to an apology than anything I'd received from him in recent months. Third, he was including Cassandra in the proposed meeting, which suggested they'd discuss strategy and decided on a unified approach to damage control. Most tellingly, he was focused on making quote, 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 rather than addressing the fundamental issues of respect and accountability that had prompted our confrontation. Daniel was still thinking in terms of managing the situation rather than genuinely changing the behavior that had created it. I waited until Sunday evening to respond, and when I did, it was with the same measured tone I'd used during our dinner conversation. Daniel, I appreciate your desire to address what happened Friday night. However, I think it's important that we approach this situation with complete honesty rather than diplomatic comfort. If you and Cassandra are genuinely interested in understanding why I'm reconsidering my estate planning, I'm willing to have that conversation. But I'm not interested in meetings designed to convince me to return to accepting treatment that I find unacceptable. His response came within minutes, revealing how anxiously he'd been waiting for my reply. Of course, Mom. We want to understand your perspective and address any concerns you have. Can we meet Tuesday evening, maybe at Romano's, so we can talk in a neutral environment? The suggestion of a restaurant meeting was tactically smart. A public setting would theoretically prevent the kind of emotional outburst that had characterized our last private conversation. But it also revealed that Daniel was still thinking of this as a negotiation rather than a reckoning. Monday morning, I had my second appointment with Patricia Morrison to finalize the legal documents that would restructure my estate according to my new priorities. I'd spent the weekend reviewing the charitable organizations I wanted to support and determining the specific conditions under which Daniel might still be able to access a portion of his inheritance. Patricia's office felt different this time, less like a place where I was exploring options and more like a place where I was implementing decisions. The lawyer herself seemed to sense the shift in my determination. Mrs. Chen, I've prepared the documents we discussed based on your instructions, she said, spreading several thick folders across her conference table. Before we proceed with signing, I want to make sure you understand exactly what these changes will mean for your family relationships and your legacy. She walked me through each document with professional thoroughness. The new will reduced Daniel's inheritance from approximately $2 million to $200,000, enough to acknowledge our family relationship, but not enough to fund the lifestyle he and Cassandra had been planning. The remaining assets would be distributed among 3 charitable organizations that reflected my values: the Literacy Program, the First Generation College Scholarship Fund, and the Hospice Care Foundation. The conditional trust structure offered Daniel a path to access an additional $500,000 if he met specific requirements within 2 years of my death. Those requirements included completing family counseling, demonstrating sustained respect for family relationships, and making amends for past disrespect through concrete actions rather than empty promises. These are substantial changes, Patricia said carefully. Are you comfortable with the possibility that your son might never qualify for the conditional trust funds? I'm comfortable with the possibility that he might choose not to earn them, I replied. The requirements aren't punitive, they're opportunities for growth and accountability. If he values money more than he values developing into a better person, then the money should go to people who will use it for genuinely worthwhile purposes. Patricia nodded slowly, apparently satisfied that I understood the implications of my decisions. And you're prepared for the family conflict this might create? The family conflict already exists, I said. I'm just deciding whether to continue absorbing it quietly or to establish consequences that might actually motivate change. We spent the next hour reviewing every detail of the new estate plan, ensuring that the language was precise and the legal protections were comprehensive. By the time I signed the final document, I felt like I'd reclaimed control over my own life and legacy. Tuesday evening arrived with another perfect Arizona sunset, and I dressed carefully for what I suspected would be my final attempt to salvage some kind of respectful relationship with Daniel and Cassandra. I chose a simple black dress that made me feel elegant and confident, paired with the diamond earrings Richard had given me for our 25th wedding anniversary. Romano's was a mid-range Italian restaurant that Daniel and I had frequented during his college years, when he was home for breaks and we were rebuilding our adult relationship. The familiar setting carried weight, memories of easier times when our conversations had been motivated by genuine affection rather than damage control. They were already seated when I arrived, and I could see the tension in both their faces as I approached the table. Daniel stood to hug me, and Cassandra offered a smile that looked more like a grimace. Both of them appeared to have dressed carefully for the occasion. Daniel in a suit that emphasized his professional success, Cassandra in a conservative dress that probably represented her attempt to look more traditional and less threatening. "Mom, thank you for agreeing to meet with us," Daniel said as I settled into my chair. "I know Friday night was difficult for everyone, and we really want to find a way to move forward." "I'm here to listen," I replied neutrally. Cassandra leaned forward slightly, her expression earnest in a way that felt practiced rather than genuine. "Dotty, I've done a lot of thinking since Friday night, and I realize that some of the things I said might have come across differently than I intended. I want you to know that I have tremendous respect for you and for everything you've accomplished in your life." The words were technically appropriate, but they rang hollow because they addressed my perception of her disrespect rather than acknowledging the disrespect itself. She was apologizing for how her words had come across, rather than taking responsibility for the attitudes those words had revealed. "What specifically are you apologizing for?" I asked. The question caught her off guard, and I could see her struggling to find language that would satisfy me without requiring her to admit genuine wrongdoing. "I'm apologizing for not being more thoughtful about how my comments might affect you," she said finally. I realized that when I talked about different decorating styles and generational preferences, it might have sounded like I was criticizing your choices personally. "Might have sounded like?" I repeated. "Cassandra, you called my home a museum. You said I was stuck in the past and had no sense of style. You traded my mother's pearls for store credit. Those weren't misunderstandings about decorating preferences. Those were deliberate dismissals of my value as a person." Daniel jumped in before Cassandra could respond, apparently sensing that her approach wasn't having the desired effect. "Mom, I think what Cassandra's trying to say is that she's sorry for hurting your feelings. We both recognize that some things were said that shouldn't have been said, and we want to find a way to repair our relationship." "What things shouldn't have been said?" I asked. "Be specific, Daniel. What exactly are you both sorry for?" The question forced them to choose between genuine accountability and continued deflection. I could see them exchanging glances, trying to determine how much admission of wrongdoing they were willing to make in exchange for resolving the inheritance crisis they'd created. "I'm sorry for saying your house felt like a museum," Cassandra said finally. "That was insensitive and hurtful. And I'm sorry for not defending you when you brought up concerns about how Cassandra talks about our family," Daniel added. "I should have taken your feelings more seriously. The apologies were partial and strategic, acknowledgments of specific actions rather than recognition of the underlying attitudes that had motivated those actions. They were sorry for getting caught, and sorry for the consequences, but they weren't sorry for the fundamental disrespect that had characterized their treatment of me for months." "Thank you for those apologies," I said. "Now I'd like to understand what you plan to do differently going forward." Again, they exchanged glances before responding. This was the question they'd clearly been dreading, the one that required them to commit to behavioral changes rather than just expressing regret for past mistakes. "I plan to be more thoughtful about how I talk about family matters," Cassandra said carefully. "And I want to find ways to honor your traditions while also incorporating our own preferences into our family celebrations." "And I plan to be more attentive to family dynamics," Daniel added. "I want to make sure everyone feels heard and respected in our family discussions." The responses were diplomatically phrased but fundamentally empty. They were offering to be more careful about how they expressed their disrespect, not to eliminate the disrespect itself. They were proposing to manage my feelings better while continuing to prioritize their own preferences and comfort. "Those are nice sentiments," I said. "But I'm more interested in concrete actions than good intentions. For example, Cassandra, what are you going to do about my mother's pearls?" The question was a test, and we all knew it. The pearls themselves weren't the real issue. The real issue was whether Cassandra was willing to acknowledge that her treatment of family heirlooms had been inappropriate and take action to correct it. "I don't think I can get them back," she said hesitantly. "The store where I traded them probably sold them to someone else by now. Did you try?" I asked. "Not yet," she admitted. "Then how do you know you can't get them back?" The logical progression of questions revealed that Cassandra had made no effort to undo the damage she'd caused, because she'd never genuinely believed that damage needed to be undone. She'd been operating under the assumption that a superficial apology would be sufficient to resolve the situation. "I'll call the store tomorrow," she said finally. "If the pearls are still available, I'll buy them back." "Good," I said. "And Daniel, what are you going to do to rebuild trust in our relationship?" My son looked uncomfortable with the directness of the question. "What would you like me to do?" "I'd like you to demonstrate that you understand why your response to my concerns was inadequate," I said. "I'd like you to show that you're capable of prioritizing respect for family relationships over your own convenience." "How can I show that?" Daniel asked. "By making it clear to Cassandra and to everyone else in your life that disrespecting your mother has consequences," I replied. "By establishing boundaries that protect our relationship instead of just managing my reactions to being mistreated." The conversation continued for another hour, but it became increasingly clear that Daniel and Cassandra were approaching the situation as a crisis to be managed, rather than an opportunity for genuine change. They were willing to make surface-level adjustments to their behavior, but they weren't willing to examine the fundamental attitudes that had created the problem in the first place. When we parted that evening, they seemed to believe that they'd successfully navigated the crisis and that their inheritance was secure. I didn't correct their misunderstanding. They would learn the truth soon enough. Wednesday morning, I received a text from Cassandra informing me that she'd contacted the jewelry store and arranged to repurchase my mother's pearls. The gesture was meaningful, but it also felt like checking an item off a list of requirements rather than making amends from genuine remorse. Thursday brought an email from Daniel with photos of a family counseling center he'd researched, suggesting that we might all benefit from professional help in improving our communication. The initiative was encouraging, but it also revealed that he still viewed our conflict as a communication problem rather than a respect problem. Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after our confrontational dinner, I received the final copies of my revised estate planning documents from Patricia Morrison's office. The legal changes were now official and irreversible. Daniel's inheritance had been reduced by more than 80%, and the conditions for accessing even the remaining funds were clearly established. That evening, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine and a sense of completion I hadn't felt in months. The roses were blooming beautifully, the desert air was cool and crisp, and I felt like I'd finally reclaimed control over my own story. My phone rang around 7 o'clock. It was Daniel, calling with the kind of casual cheerfulness that suggested he believed our relationship had returned to normal. "Hi, Mom. I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. Cassandra got your mother's pearls back, and we're both looking forward to moving past all this drama and getting back to planning our future." "I'm glad to hear about the pearls," I said, "and I'm glad you're focused on planning your future. It's important to be realistic about what that future is going to look like." Something in my tone must have alerted him that the conversation wasn't heading in the direction he'd expected. "What do you mean?" "I mean that actions have consequences, Daniel. And the actions you and Cassandra took regarding my place in your family are going to have consequences that will affect your future in ways you probably haven't considered." The silence that followed was heavy with dawning understanding. Daniel was finally beginning to grasp that his mother's hurt feelings might translate into changes that would impact his comfortable assumptions about his financial security. "Mom, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've updated my will," I replied calmly. "I've made sure that my legacy will go to people and organizations that actually value the principles of respect, kindness, and family loyalty that I've tried to live by." The phone call that followed was exactly what I'd expected. Panic, bargaining, promises of change, and desperate attempts to undo decisions that were already final. But for the first time in months, I felt like the person with the power in our relationship. The consequences they'd never imagined were finally becoming real. 3 months had passed since I'd delivered the news about my revised will to Daniel, and the changes in our family dynamic had been swift and revealing. The desperate phone calls stopped after the first week, once Daniel and Cassandra realized that no amount of pleading or promising would reverse decisions I'd made with careful deliberation. The angry phase lasted about a month, during which I received several hostile messages questioning my sanity, my fairness, and my understanding of family loyalty. The silence that followed was the most telling response of all. I spent those quiet months rediscovering who I was when I wasn't constantly trying to earn respect from people who'd already decided I wasn't worth respecting. I enrolled in a watercolor painting class at the community center, something I'd been wanting to do for years but had never prioritized. I joined a book club at the library, where I met a fascinating group of women who valued thoughtful conversation and different perspectives. I even accepted an invitation to dinner from Robert Martinez, the widower who'd been asking me out for the past year. Robert turned out to be wonderful company, intelligent, kind, and genuinely interested in my thoughts and experiences. He'd been married for 42 years before losing his wife to cancer, and he understood the complex process of rebuilding a life after loss. Most importantly, he treated me with the kind of natural respect that I'd forgotten was possible in relationships. During our third dinner together, Robert asked about my family, and I found myself telling him the whole story about Daniel and Cassandra. He listened without judgment, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that helped me process my own feelings about the situation. "Do you miss them?" he asked as we walked through the botanical gardens after our meal. "I miss the relationship I thought we had," I replied honestly. "I miss the son I thought I'd raised and the family I thought we were building together. But I don't miss the constant feeling of being diminished and dismissed. Sometimes loving someone means refusing to enable their worst impulses," Robert said gently. "It sounds like you gave them every opportunity to choose respect over convenience." His understanding felt like a balm to wounds I'd been carrying for months. I'd questioned my decision countless times, wondering if I'd been too harsh or too unforgiving. But Robert's perspective helped me see that accountability wasn't cruelty. It was love expressed through boundaries rather than accommodation. The holidays arrived with their own challenges and revelations. For the first time in 34 years, I didn't host Thanksgiving dinner. Instead, I spent the day volunteering at a homeless shelter, serving meals to people who understood that gratitude wasn't something to be taken for granted. The experience was more meaningful than any family gathering I'd attended in recent memory. Christmas brought an unexpected gift, a card from my granddaughter Emma, Daniel's daughter from his first marriage who lived with her mother in Colorado. Emma was 22 now, working as a nurse and engaged to a young man who'd apparently heard stories about me from Daniel that didn't match the version he'd been telling Cassandra. "Grandma Dotty," the card read, "I heard about what happened with Dad and Cassandra, and I wanted you to know that I think you're amazing for standing up for yourself. I remember how you always treated everyone with respect and kindness, and I'm sorry they couldn't see your worth. I'd love to visit you sometime if you're open to it." The card made me cry, not from sadness, but from the recognition that the values I'd tried to instill in my family hadn't been completely lost. Emma had been listening and learning, even during the years when Daniel had been drifting away from those same principles. I called Emma that evening, and we talked for 2 hours about her work, her engagement, and her memories of family gatherings at my house. She remembered details I'd forgotten, how I'd always made sure everyone felt included, how I'd mediated conflicts without taking sides, how I'd created traditions that brought people together rather than dividing them. "Dad used to be different," Emma said sadly. "I remember him defending you when my mom's family would make comments about your cooking or your decorating. He used to say you were the strongest person he knew." "He's not a bad person," I replied, meaning it. "He's just lost sight of what matters most." Sometimes people need to experience real consequences before they remember who they want to be. Spring arrived with news that Daniel and Cassandra had postponed their wedding indefinitely. Eleanor Henderson, who maintained an impressive network of neighborhood connections, reported that financial stress was straining their relationship. The house they'd been planning to buy required a larger down payment than they could manage without Daniel's expected inheritance, and the wedding they'd designed required a budget that assumed family financial support. Apparently, they've been arguing about whether to scale back their plans or find another way to fund their lifestyle, Eleanor told me over coffee in my garden. Cassandra's been pushing Daniel to take out loans against his future earnings, but he's finally starting to understand that his future might not be as financially secure as he'd assumed. The news gave me no satisfaction. I'd never wanted Daniel to suffer. I'd wanted him to grow. But growth often required discomfort, and discomfort was something Daniel had spent years avoiding. The real surprise came in early April, when I received a phone call from Daniel asking if he could visit me alone. His voice was different, quieter, more uncertain than I'd heard it in years. He sounded like the little boy who used to come to me when he'd made mistakes and needed help figuring out how to make them right. "I don't want to discuss the will or try to change your mind about anything," he said carefully. "I just want to talk to you as your son if you're willing." I agreed to see him, curious about what had prompted this request after months of silence. When he arrived that Saturday afternoon, I was struck by how much older he looked. The confident, successful lawyer who'd dismissed my concerns 6 months ago had been replaced by a man who seemed genuinely uncertain about his direction in life. We sat in my living room, the same room Cassandra had dismissed as outdated, and Daniel looked around with what appeared to be genuine appreciation for the first time in years. "I remember doing homework at that desk," he said, pointing to the antique secretary, where he'd spent countless hours during high school. "You used to bring me snacks and help me with my essays when I got stuck." "You were always a good student," I replied, "thoughtful and thorough when you applied yourself." "I've been thinking a lot about who I used to be," Daniel said, his voice carrying a weight I hadn't heard before. "About the values you taught me and how far I've drifted from them. I've been thinking about Dad and what he would think about the man I've become." The mention of Richard surprised me. Daniel rarely talked about his father anymore, and I'd assumed he'd moved beyond needing that connection to his past. "What do you think he would say?" I asked. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I think he'd be disappointed in me. I think he'd be ashamed that I let someone disrespect you, and that I chose my own comfort over defending my mother." The admission was more honest than anything I'd heard from Daniel in years. It suggested that the consequences of his choices had finally forced him to examine not just their practical impact, but their moral implications. "Your father loved you very much," I said gently. "He would want you to learn from your mistakes and become the man you're capable of being." "I don't know if I can," Daniel said. "I don't know if I remember how to be that person anymore. I've been performing for so long that I'm not sure there's anything authentic left underneath." "There is," I said with certainty. "I can see him right now. He's the man who's sitting in my living room taking responsibility for his choices instead of making excuses for them." We talked for 3 hours that afternoon, and it was the most genuine conversation we'd had in years. Daniel told me about his doubts regarding his relationship with Cassandra, his growing recognition that they wanted fundamentally different things from life, and his realization that he'd been prioritizing appearances over authenticity for longer than he'd admitted. "I think I stayed with her because she made me feel successful," he said. "She was beautiful and accomplished, and being with her felt like proof that I'd made it in the world. But I never felt like she actually knew me or loved me for who I was underneath all the achievements." "And now?" I asked. "Now I'm wondering if I know who I am underneath all the achievements," he replied. "I'm wondering if I've built a life that looks impressive from the outside, but feels empty from the inside." When Daniel left that evening, he hugged me with the kind of sincere affection I remembered from his childhood. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he said, "even when I gave up on myself." 2 weeks later, Daniel called to tell me that he and Cassandra had ended their engagement. The decision had been mutual, he said, though it had been prompted by his growing understanding that they were incompatible in ways that couldn't be resolved through compromise. "She's not a bad person," he said, echoing my own words about him. "She's just someone who values different things than I do. Or different things than I want to value." The breakup created space for Daniel to begin rebuilding his authentic self and our relationship. He started coming to dinner every other Sunday, not because he felt obligated, but because he genuinely enjoyed our conversations. He asked about my painting classes, my book club, and my friendship with Robert. He shared his own struggles with finding meaning in work that paid well but didn't fulfill him. Most importantly, he started showing up as himself rather than as the person he thought I wanted him to be. He talked about his fears, his doubts, and his hopes with the kind of vulnerability that created real intimacy rather than performative connection. 6 months after our reconciliation, Daniel met Sarah, a social worker who shared his growing interest in work that made a difference, rather than just making money. Sarah was kind, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in building relationships with Daniel's family. When he brought her to dinner for the first time, she complimented my cooking sincerely and asked thoughtful questions about my life and interests. "Your son talks about you constantly," she told me as we worked together in the kitchen after dinner. "He says you're the strongest person he knows, and that he spent years trying to live up to your example." The words reminded me of Emma's memory of how Daniel used to defend me, and I felt a profound sense of gratitude that my son had found his way back to valuing strength and authenticity over style and convenience. A year after I'd changed my will, Daniel asked to speak with me about his inheritance. I'd been wondering when this conversation would come, and I was curious about how he would approach it. "I want you to know that I understand why you made the changes you did," he began. "I want you to know that I think you were right to establish consequences for how I treated you. And I want you to know that I'm not asking you to change anything back." The statement surprised me. I'd expected him to ask about the conditional trust or the requirements for accessing additional funds. Instead, he was expressing support for decisions that had cost him significant money. "I am curious about one thing," he continued. "What would it take for me to earn back your trust? Not for the money, but for the relationship. What would it take for you to believe that I've really changed?" The question showed me how much Daniel had grown over the past year. He was thinking about trust and relationship rather than just financial consequences. He was focused on who he wanted to be rather than what he wanted to have. "You've already started earning it back," I told him honestly. "You've been honest about your mistakes, you've taken responsibility for your choices, and you've shown me through your actions that you understand what went wrong. Trust is rebuilt through consistency over time, and you're doing that work." As I sit here now, 2 years after that devastating dinner conversation with Daniel and Cassandra, I can see that changing my will was never really about the money. It was about refusing to enable behavior that diminished both of us. It was about establishing boundaries that protected not just my dignity, but also Daniel's opportunity to grow into the man he was capable of being. The charitable organizations that will receive the majority of my estate are doing wonderful work that reflects the values I've spent my life practicing. The literacy program has helped hundreds of adults learn to read. The scholarship fund has sent dozens of first-generation college students to universities they never could have afforded. The Hospice Foundation has provided comfort and dignity to families facing loss. But the most important legacy I've created is the relationship I've rebuilt with my son. Daniel earned his way back into my trust through changed behavior rather than empty promises. He's become the kind of man who stands up for what's right, even when it's inconvenient, who values authenticity over appearances, and who understands that love sometimes requires difficult choices. The conditions in my will remain in place, but I have every confidence that Daniel will meet them when the time comes. Not because he wants access to additional funds, but because he's become the kind of person who naturally embodies the values those conditions represent. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept less than the people you love are capable of giving. Sometimes accountability is the greatest gift you can offer someone who's lost their way. Sometimes saying no to disrespect is the only way to create space for genuine respect to grow. I learned that an outdated grandmother can still teach her family valuable lessons about dignity, self-worth, and the power of consequences. I learned that it's never too late to demand better treatment or to change course when relationships aren't serving anyone's highest good. Most importantly, I learned that updating my will gave me something more valuable than financial security. It gave me back my self-respect and, ultimately, my son. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.